Next, the head of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson, testifies about the President's 2019 budget request for HUD. This Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee hearing is just under 2 hours.
This hearing will come to order. Today, the committee will receive testimony from Dr. Ben Carson, the 17th Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Welcome back, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Over the past year, Secretary Carson has made significant strides in his efforts to make HUD programs more effective and efficient. He has embarked upon a multi-month listening tour, traveling across the country to develop a deeper understanding of the effect that HUD policies have on affordable housing practitioners and families who are the most vulnerable. Not long after returning from the tour, Secretary Carson took on a major leadership role in coordinating hurricane relief efforts in Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, providing both immediate and long-term relief to thousands of families who have been displaced from their homes and are without electricity. That work continues. As a nominee just over a year ago, Secretary Carson testified before this committee about the importance of revisiting our nation's housing programs to ensure that families who are struggling in America have the best opportunity to climb the economic and social ladder, to break intergenerational cycles of poverty, and to become self-sufficient. Secretary Carson has also stressed the importance of aligning regulatory requirements in ways that incentivize landlord participation in HUD programs, eliminate undue burden on program participants, enhance workforce mobility, and maximize the percentage of HUD dollars that go straight to the families that need it. I could not agree more with these goals, and I thank Secretary Carson and his team for working with this committee to achieve these objectives. Last week, by voting 67-31 to pass the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, the Senate took a decisive step forward in addressing these same issues. A lot of the debate on the floor last week highlighted how the legislation right-sizes regulations for community banks and credit unions to promote economic development and lending. But the bill also makes important improvements to housing programs. It provides critical regulatory relief to over 1,000 small rural public housing agencies, making it easier for them to develop new projects and coordinate with their neighbors. And it ensures that more of their budgets go straight to families rather than to legal paperwork. The bill makes it less expensive for nonprofits like Habitat for Humanity to build homes in underserved communities. It makes a greater number of families eligible for HUD's Family Self-Sufficiency Program, and enhances the program so that it can offer new additional services to participants. It permits renters to stay in their homes for at least 90 days after their home is foreclosed upon, and it permanently extends the amount of time a service member may stay in his or her home after returning from military service to 1 year before the home may be foreclosed upon. We hope this bill will soon be signed into law. Today, I look forward to hearing about more opportunities for us to keep moving forward, working together to modernize and improve our housing programs. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Glad you're here. HUD plays a critical role in the success of our housing market, our communities, our families, our goals as a nation. So it is disturbing, extremely disturbing to read about one controversy after another at your department. Ethics lawyers ignored, procurement guidelines scoffed at, whistleblowers facing retaliation, anti-discrimination efforts downgraded, key positions filled based on patronage rather than competence. It goes on and on and on and on. Instead of taking responsibility, Mr. Secretary, you seem to want to blame others. Your wife picked out the furniture without knowing the price. Your spokesman said something, but not you. You shouldn't be blamed for not listening to your ethics lawyers. The press is unfair. It goes on and on and on and on. Blaming others seems to be the order of the day in the swamp. I think you need to take responsibility and get things right. HUD's mission is too important to do otherwise. And getting things right means fighting for the funding needed to help more people in this country get a roof over their head. Despite the importance of affordable housing, it's increasingly out of reach. A quarter of all renters today pay over half their incomes for housing, including 400,000 households in Ohio alone. Homelessness increased last year in the 8th year of an economic expansion. Repeat that, homelessness increased while you were Secretary of HUD in the 8th year of an economic expansion, beginning with the auto rescue with President Obama setting the course of that economic expansion. Earlier this week, one of our great Ohio housing advocates described the affordable housing crisis as a, quote, all hands on deck situation. But HUD chose to go AWOL instead. Rather than making new investments in affordable housing in our communities, the budget proposal, there's no debate in this, the budget proposal adds to the ranks of the homeless. 3 months ago, the administration was entirely unconcerned about the deficit when it chose to add more than $1 trillion to our national debt over the next decade. Say that again. When this Congress passed the tax cut that went, as we know, overwhelmingly to the wealthiest people in our country, it added $1 trillion to the deficit. Didn't seem to be much interest from you, the members of the cabinet, the president, or members of this body and the majority about the national debt increase over the next decade. But all of a sudden, Secretary Carson and your colleagues, you've rediscovered grave concerns about the budget deficit, such that it's time to charge extremely poor people significantly higher rents. It's outrageous. The top 1% of the country, and you and most members of the president's cabinet are among that top 1%. The top 1% of this country will eventually get 83% of the benefits of the $1 trillion tax cut. Then you and this administration think it's okay to charge poor people more for their rent. To reduce the deficit that this tax cut for millionaires and corporations will create, HUD proposes that some of the poorest households in this country must pay an increase of as much as $1,800 a year in rent. That's just shameful. All told, HUD wants to charge an estimated $2 billion in higher rents to low-income families through what you all call rent reforms. The administration claims its cuts will recognize a greater role for state and local governments in the private sector. You always say that, but federal assistance, you know, reaches only 1 out of every 4 eligible families. State and local governments are already strapped for cash. Go anywhere in the country and ask them that. We know they don't have the capacity to take on those evicted by federal cuts without raising taxes on working families. Last year, Secretary Carson, you reassured the public that HUD's budget cuts, you said it in this committee, HUD's budget cuts would be offset in the administration's infrastructure package. I have no idea if you pushed the administration infrastructure package to live up to your promise, but I do know the president's proposal did not include funding for housing and community development, despite your assurances, quote, housing is part of the infrastructure in this country and it will be treated as such. That's shameful too. There's no funding for capital spending for public housing, despite a backlog of needed repairs of tens of billions of dollars. Under your leadership, Secretary Carson, HUD has decided a wobbly chair in a private D.C. dining room requires the urgent attention of no fewer than 16 staffers and thousands of taxpayer dollars. Unsafe and unsanitary conditions in public housing that puts working families and children at risk. Not our problem, you say. Let them use vouchers. Sounds rather 19th century, doesn't it? Excuse me, 18th century. But there's a problem. You're already underfunding Section 8 accounts. You can't say everybody in public housing must shift to Section 8 and then not provide the money for it to happen. This budget is an embarrassment, but it and the news out of the administration of late out of the Department of late seem all too common in this administration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary Carson, we now turn to you. You can make your opening remarks, and then we will follow that with questions from the committee. Please proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Brown, members of this committee, Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the work we do at the Department of Housing and Urban Development and my plans for fulfilling our mission with fidelity to our congressional mandate and the best interest of the American people. The President's 2019 budget proposes more than $41 billion for HUD, a 1.4% increase over last year's request. We believe this is sufficient to effectively administer our core programs, continuing needed assistance to those individuals and families whom we currently serve, our most vulnerable populations, especially the elderly and persons living with disabilities. In addition, the requested level of funding for the Housing Choice Voucher Program will continue to support the same number of households as we currently serve and should not result in the termination of any housing vouchers. HUD's budget would also make a significant investment to continue the fight to end homelessness. Our budget proposes a record $2.4 billion to support thousands of local homeless assistance programs across our country. As a doctor for many years, I'm all too familiar with the effects of lead exposure in the developing brain. As a result, we're requesting $145 million to ensure that homes are free of lead-based paint hazards and other dangerous contaminants, especially for families with small children. I also recognize that we need to do a better job respecting that the funds we spend ultimately belong to the public. Consequently, I have directed HUD's new Chief Financial Officer, Irv Dennis, to design and implement a transformation plan and lead an internal task force within HUD to combat waste, fraud, and abuse. Irv has more than 36 years of private sector experience and is the perfect person to bring that kind of business acumen to the task. Mr. Chairman, in spite of the billions of dollars we spent as a nation trying to keep pace with the capital needs of our public housing stock, it hasn't worked. In fact, we're falling further and further behind. This budget recognizes that we need another way. HUD is proposing to pivot from the current financially unsustainable public housing model and working with public housing authorities seek a new way to produce and preserve affordable housing that so many families need. We're asking for the authority to give local public housing authorities the flexibility to use their operating funds to support their capital needs. And we're proposing to convert many more distressed public housing units to a project-based Section 8 financing model through the Rental Assistance Demonstration, or RAD. To date, RAD has stimulated more than $5 billion in private investment to preserve this housing. Simply put, RAD is working. The budget proposes to open the door wider and allow more public housing authorities to participate in this innovative approach. HUD is also supporting sustainable homeownership through the programs at the Federal Housing Administration. Building household wealth through homeownership remains a keystone to helping Americans climb the economic ladder of success. That's why we've taken several steps to ensure FHA can continue to be a reliable source of mortgage financing in years to come. I'm also here today to repeat a request that you've heard from us for many years now and from several administrations. We absolutely need to invest in FHA's information systems. FHA is built on a mainframe that is over 4 decades old. Staff at our home ownership centers still work on paper case files, creating inefficiencies and posing numerous quality control issues. Mr. Chairman and members of this subcommittee, last year was one of the most destructive in our nation's history in terms of natural disasters, with 3 devastating hurricanes and destructive wildfires and mudslides in California. HUD is already supporting the long-term recovery that is taking shape in Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Clearly, we have a lot of work ahead of us. Since last September, Congress has appropriated more than $35 billion through HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. We've allocated the $7.4 billion appropriated in September, and soon we'll be allocating another $28 billion. Nearly every program office at HUD has staff working on disaster recovery, many of whom have volunteered to travel to disaster-stricken areas and serve on the front lines. My prayers are always with those who are still struggling to recovery. We will continue to stand with them throughout the recovery process. Chairman Crapo, before I conclude, I want to take a moment to commend you and your colleagues from both sides of the aisle for your work on S-2155, the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act. This legislation contains a number of common-sense housing provisions, including regulatory relief for small, rural PHAs, streamlining the HUD's Family Self-Sufficiency Program, and important protections for veterans with federally backed mortgages. In closing, Mr. Chairman, HUD's essential mission is to provide safe, fair, and affordable housing for the American people. Our mission also supports opportunity and self-sufficiency so that families can move toward economic independence. I'm eager to work with Congress and all the members of this committee to achieve what I believe are our common goals to better serve our fellow Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and again, we appreciate your being here with us today. I assure you there's strong support for the commitment you've made to improving and strengthening affordable housing in America, and we appreciate the efforts that the agency is putting into it. I also appreciate your comments with regard to the recent legislation we passed in the Senate, Senate Bill 2155, and that's where I'm going to focus my questions.
Okay.
S-2155 would streamline regulatory requirements for small public housing agencies operating in rural areas, including simplified calculations for utility consumption in public housing, relaxed inspection requirements, exemptions from environmental review requirements, and shared waiting lists. The feedback I've received from the small public housing authorities is that these reforms would benefit residents, local housing authorities, and other sponsors of public housing and housing choice voucher programs. First of all, do you agree with that analysis, and could you explain how this would help?
Yes, I do agree with them very strongly. I mean, these are common sense solutions and take into account the differences between small PHAs and the large ones. And now they can focus their attention on actually the services for the people as opposed to filling out endless forms. And I'm sure they're extremely grateful for this.
Well, thank you. And just one more question on that bill. S-2155 would also enhance HUD's Family Self-Sufficiency Program by expanding it to more HUD-assisted families and enabling current participants to obtain job training, education, and child care services as they save up to achieve financial independence. Can you talk about how these provisions will help the families receiving housing assistance and help them to achieve economic stability and mobility?
Yes, well, this is exactly what we need to be doing. Obviously, by amalgamating the programs, the self-sufficiency programs for both the public housing and the Section 8 program, a lot of efficiency and savings has occurred. And we can move people toward better education, jobs, decreasing debt, increasing savings, and really making them much more a part of the American dream. So that's why I'm such a strong supporter of self-sufficiency acts. And in the past, one of the things that we've been guilty of, and I'd say we collectively as government, is we tend to pull the support from people when they begin to climb the ladder of self-sufficiency. And we're acutely aware of that. And we'll work with you all to make sure that we are not sending the wrong messages to people.
Thank you. And now I want to turn to one of our next very high priorities in the committee, housing finance reform. We're now approaching a full decade since Fannie and Freddie were taken into conservatorship. Finding a comprehensive solution to our housing finance system remains a top priority for me for the remainder of this Congress, and I think for all of us. Can you speak to the role HUD has played and will continue to play in exploring opportunities for housing finance reform?
Well, you know, HUD obviously is the home of FHA and Ginnie Mae. FHA has a portfolio of $1.2 trillion. Ginnie Mae, $1.9 trillion. So you're talking over $3 trillion. So obviously it's a very important player in the whole discussion about finance reform. Also, you know, FHA has been the one who has really concentrated on first-time home buyers, on minorities, and people who frequently have not benefited as much from the private sector lending facilities. And we must continue that strong component if we want these people to be able to realize the American dream itself. Also, in terms of making sure that fair housing practices prevail throughout our system. That's something that we're very much concentrated on. And making sure that we maintain the financial stability of the system with such things as the mandated 2% capital ratio. And you know, things have been done to make sure that we maintain that against you know, popular demand.
Thank you very much. Senator Brown.
You testify. You began your testimony by saying this year's request is 1.4% above last year's request, but it's, and I need a yes or no answer here because I have a lot of things I want to cover, but it is a 14% cut from fiscal year 2017 enacted level, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. I think it's important to put that out there and not to mislead by saying it's a 1.4% increase from a proposal that was ignored by this Congress last year. One of your proposals would charge mandatory minimum rents. What is the annual income of a typical family that would be affected by this policy change?
Most of these families are obviously distressed. I think the number that you're probably looking for is about $9,870.
Okay, it's actually less. I'm not looking for any number. I just want the facts. It's less than that. How much would they be charged under your policy?
The charge is going to be 30% of the income. And for those who are work able, that don't have any things that are impinging upon them, 35% of gross.
Doesn't that strike you as fairly remarkable in the era of tax cuts that have gone to upper income people and a bigger budget deficit that you say 9,000, our numbers are that the income is less than that, but if it's 3,000 or 9,000 that you're charging that group of people as much as $1,800, and that's a version that CBPP says was a leaked version as much as $1,800. So if somebody's making $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 a year and you're charging them $1,800 more for their rent, is that what you became Secretary of HUD to want to do?
One of the things that I think is very important is that we be realistic about our budgets. We are
realistic about a budget after you all supported this tax cut, blowing a hole in the federal budget, and you want to make up for it by charging somebody making $5,000 a year $150 extra a month. You call that realistic. Others would call it cruel.
Last Friday, for the first time, we passed the $21 trillion threshold in terms of the national debt.
And
if we continue to accumulate debt at that rate,
I don't need the lecture, Mr. Secretary. I understand that, but I wish you had said that several months ago when this Congress passed a tax cut that went to you and the president's cabinet and people in the top 1% that are getting millions of dollars in a tax cut. Now it's time to talk about the budget deficit. Maybe you should have thought a little ahead as you plan to cut funding for low-income people. Don't forget, 1 out of 4 people in this country who rent spend 50% or more of their income for housing. One thing happens in their lives, and it's just a downward spiral. You know that. Okay, a couple other questions. 5,200 Ohioans died from drug overdoses in the 12 months measured by the most recent CDC report, a 36% increase from August to August, what we have. That number probably understates the deaths. You apparently hired a 24-year-old campaign worker with no relevant experience to work on this issue at HUD. Is that true?
There was someone who was hired. I generally don't get involved with lower level.
Okay, so you don't get involved in tables selection. Your wife does, even though she's not a federal employee. You don't get involved in ethics issues.
If you're going to be throwing out these kind of charges, you should give me an opportunity to answer them.
I will after I'm finished with the last question. Last June, you hired a chief information officer, Johnson Joy, who resigned this week. Why did you choose him, and why did he resign after only 9 months on the job?
He had a tremendous amount of experience in technological advancement, and we needed to make a very significant transformation. I lost confidence in his ability to lead.
Mr. Joy apparently used a contractor to hire a friend, Navid Jaffrey, who wildly exaggerated his resume. Do you think it'd be better to advertise and compete for these jobs rather than hiring cronies through a subcontractor in the future as you move forward?
I do not hire cronies and subcontractors.
Well,
I don't do that.
HUD seems to under your leadership. Why did Mr. Jaffrey and Mr. Joy leave only this week after this story hit the media? Is that the first you knew about it?
As soon as I found out about the problems, we dealt with them.
Does it bother you that you don't know these things are going on in your agency until the media write about them?
I don't think that that's a fair characterization.
Well, it just was with these two. You just said you found out about it, and these were pretty high-profile political people. You found out about it, and then you fired them.
One was high-profile, one was not. And when we find out about it, we dealt with it.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, as you remember, I voted to confirm you. 4 other Democrats on this committee voted to confirm you. I'm not sure I made the right decision. Thank you.
Senator Shelby.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. A little different tone now.
Thank you.
You've been here a year. You've been in about a year as secretary now, more or less. What are some of the things that you've gotten your arms around? What are some of the accomplishments in a year? A year is not a long time, I know that.
Right.
Just some of the positive things?
Well, there's been a multitude of things. One of the first things I was hit with was the demand that we proceed with the 25 basis point reduction in the insurance premium. And that had been put in place by the administration that was leaving without, I think, a lot of thought. And
Save people a lot of money, wouldn't it?
Yeah, they thought it would allow more people to be able to purchase homes. We thought it was done inappropriately and said, hold on, let's look at this.
Okay.
We have to maintain that 2% capital ratio. We maintained a 2.09. If we had gone with the 25 basis point reduction, we would have ended up with a 1.76, and we would have had to come to the Treasury to borrow money like we did in 2013, and this whole hearing would have been about that and tables.
As you look forward now, what are still, you've been here 1 year, been there 1 year now, what are still your biggest challenges? I know there are a lot of them in the HUD.
Homelessness is a big one.
Senator Brown mentioned homelessness a few minutes ago.
Right.
But isn't there some connection to our challenge in our communities of mental health of all of our people and homelessness? I know in my hometown of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a lot of the homeless, maybe not everywhere, are deeply challenged with mental health.
Absolutely, that is a huge
connection?
That's a huge problem throughout our country. You know, we made a mistake about 30 years ago with some of our rulings to take these people out of a setting where they could be easily taken care of. And we have an obligation, I think, to take care of those people.
What are some of your other challenges that you're trying to get your arms around?
Well, we have the Superfund problem going on in various places around the country. Dilapidated housing in many places. We have...
Expand on dilapidated housing, because I see it everywhere. I see it in Birmingham. I see it in Atlanta. I see it in Chicago. I see it everywhere.
Well, for instance, in Cairo, there was just horrible oversight there by the housing authority. And these places are totally uninhabitable. We had to come in and find a way to house those people in a relatively quick manner. There are other places, you look at what's happening in NYCHA, you know, there are issues going on all over the country. We're trying to address them. We're looking at why did these things happen in the first place. We've had to get rid of dozens of inspectors who have consistently been providing inappropriate scoring. There are a number of other underlying issues that have to be taken care of in order to create the right kind of platform so that we don't have these problems.
What do you expect to accomplish? You hope if everything worked out for you, say in another year, what would you hope to get your hands around?
Well, I want us to, first of all, get systems in place and the kinds of operating controls in place at HUD so that we don't have things being done in an inappropriate way. You know, this whole furniture issue is an example of that. We're putting in controls so that that doesn't happen while I'm here or after I leave. Mm-hmm. I think that's vitally important, and it saves taxpayer money that way as well. I also want us to change the image from that of just trying to get more people into a program into one where we actually provide people with a ladder to be able to escape. And, you know, we're working through the Envision Centers concept because there's a lot of need in our country. And there's also a lot of resources, a lot of people who actually are compassionate. But the two generally are not juxtaposed. We're going to juxtapose those, and I think that's going to make an extremely big difference. We're also enhancing Section 3. It's been on the books for 50 years, but we're going to put some teeth into it so that we can increase the workforce and also give people the kind of skills which will allow them to escape dependency. It's really about empowering our people. And yes, we need more affordable housing. We need to look at creative ways in which to create affordable housing. But we also need to be looking at ways to move people out of affordable housing in a positive sense and making more room for others so that we don't have these long waiting lists. We need to look at it from both ends.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Menendez.
Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, in an interview with the New York Times last May after visiting low-income housing in Ohio, you cautioned against making such housing, quote, a comfortable setting that would make anybody want to stay. I'll just stay here and they will take care of me, was your quote. Now, apparently, your aversion to comforts and extravagance don't flow to your office. In response to news reports that you had ordered a 31,000 dining room set, a HUD spokesman told CNN in February, quote, Mrs. Carson and the Secretary had no awareness that the table was being purchased. Now, when you were asked this Tuesday in the House, you replied that you did not intend to be responsible for what anyone else said, which is an extraordinary statement because every one of us is responsible for what our spokespeople say. If he was wrong, he or you should have had the record set straight. Given what your spokesperson had said and the lack of any correction from HUD, your post to Facebook on March the 5th can only be read to indicate that you had no prior knowledge of the furniture selection. You said, quote, I was surprised as anyone to find out that a $31,000 dining room set had been ordered. But in a chain of emails dating back to August of last year, staff at the department referred to the furniture set, quote, the Secretary and Mrs. Carson picked it out. So let me ask you, why did you mislead the American public, the taxpayers that fund the department's activities, and tell them you were not aware of this purchase when it is indisputable that you and your wife were involved in selecting this particular furniture set?
Well, it's not indisputable. I wrote in the Post on the 5th what my involvement was. It says there very clearly what the involvement was. So for a week later,
all those emails of your staff were wrong. Your spokesperson was wrong. I mean, it's unbelievable.
all what emails? Tell me what the email said.
The emails go back to August 2017. Staff of the department referred to the furniture set that, quote, the Secretary and Mrs. Carson picked out. Did they make that up?
No, but I indicated that in the posting that we were involved because they asked us to be involved to pick something and that I thought the pricing was too high. But here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that the furniture is not at HUD, and there is no charge to the American people, to the taxpayer.
But only because the issues were
And
raised,
we
Mr.
have
Secretary.
we have put special, or I've asked the CFO to put in place what we need to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Let me go to a different set of questions. January 5th, 2018, is it true that the department issued a notice effectively delaying implementation of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, a long overdue rule to help communities address persistent racial segregation and meet their obligations on the Fair Housing Act?
It is.
Is it just simply true, yes or no?
It is true to say that we have been asked by dozens of municipalities to hold off on that because it was costing them between $100,000 and $800,000, and they had to hire people.
Yes, it has been delayed.
And they were not able to comply with it.
Yes, it has been delayed. Is that correct? That's
Yes.
not a false statement. Now, is it true that the department's fiscal 2019 budget requests $3.5 million less than 2017 enacted levels for fair housing programs?
I think
Just simply a yes or no. Is that a factually correct statement?
it is not a simple yes or no.
Whether there's $3.5 million less?
No, what
I
is
think it doesn't take a brain surgeon to understand whether there's $3.5 million less in the budget or not.
what is important is what are we attempting to do? Would it be possible to actually talk about some of the actual principles of what we're trying to do?
Is it true that, I would like you to answer my question since you're rarely here before the Committee on Housing Issues, this is I think the first time since your nomination. So is it true that the department is considering changes to its mission statement? I read that in March 7th, the department confirmed that it is considering changes to its mission statement, including to remove references to inclusive communities and communities free from discrimination.
It is not at all unusual when a new secretary comes in to change the mission statement.
Do you intend to take those statements?
And we have, at the senior staff level, discussed changing it. The first iteration is the one that you've read from. The next iteration was after we've gotten input from all the staff, all 7,000 people who work at HUD. That was my instruction. That it, got out and became a news story, that was not the intention.
Well, look, let me close by saying mission statements may not be policy directives, but in this case, you've established a pattern and a practice of suggesting that HUD intends to reverse course and ignore its statutory obligations to end housing discrimination and promote inclusive communities. And that's not something that many of us are going to stand by.
I'm not going to stand by it either when characterized that way. That's not at all what we're doing.
We'll see what the end result is, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that you realize that you signed up to be a human pinata, but so far it has been a bit challenging this morning, and part of it has been around the issue of the table. Folks are seeing that as an opportunity to delve into some important questions, some important issues as well, as opposed to the focus and the attention that you've given to HUD and self-sufficiency. So I would love for you to have an opportunity to answer the question about the table on record and as relates to the overall spending that you've seen or you've authorized in HUD around refurbishing, refurnishing, decorating.
Thank you.
Please put that to rest for us.
Thank you. The initial stories talked about extravagant taste of my wife in decorating my office. We spent a total of less than $3,500 decorating my office, considerably less than the historical norm. The second story, it's not a table, it's 17 pieces of furniture that we were asked to replace because it could no longer be repaired after multiple attempts to repair it. The bottom line is that table has not materialized, and there is no cost to the people, none whatsoever, not even a penalty cost for whoever ordered it, initially ordering it. Also, we've taken advantage of the opportunity to put in place controls to make sure that this process is done correctly. And even though I wasn't aware of the $5,000 requirement, I still take responsibility for it, you know, as the head of the agency, and I take responsibility for fixing it.
Good.
And we have done that.
Thank you. Let's talk about HUD and the responsibilities of HUD for a few minutes, as I have a few minutes left. You were kind enough to start a listening tour around this country to understand and appreciate the severity of the problem of housing. Yes. You were born and lived in poverty. I lived in a single-parent household and understand the fragile nature of housing for those folks who are living close to the edge and, frankly, sometimes under the edge. You spent some time in Spartanburg, South Carolina, looking at the benefits of the Historic Preservation Tax Credit and the power of making housing more affordable. Part of the legislation that you mentioned, 2155, is my family's Self-Sufficiency Act that has a pathway to a better future. Will you talk about the importance of legislation like the Family Sufficiency Act, as well as our conversation yesterday around the opportunity zones and the opportunity for us to leverage private capital with public dollars and do something significant for those folks living in public assisted housing today?
Well, thank you so much. First of all, for the tremendous effort that you've put into family self-sufficiency with the right attitude, because, you know, these people are resources for this country. And we need to be thinking about how do we develop people, not spending so much time talking about objects and houses. Houses are an important part of the development of a person and giving them the kind of foundation that they need. I am absolutely thrilled with the public-private partnerships and some of the things that I saw in South Carolina with you, how you're able to convert a place that, you know, was previously a refuge for drug addicts and people who were selling drugs and all kinds of criminal activity, prostitution, et cetera, and change that to a flourishing community. And the big key being by bringing the private sector into the equation, they now have an interest in the maintenance of that facility. You know, there are a number of different types of family self-sufficiency programs. One of the ones that we are proposing now would take part of the monthly subsidy and put it into an escrow account, and you're very familiar with that concept. And that escrow is tied to that particular unit, and all the routine maintenance for that unit comes out of that escrow. So if the screen always needs to be replaced, that's coming out of that. Light bulbs, if you're always calling the plumber, that's coming out of that. But if you learn to lift the lid and fix that plunger yourself, it's growing. And if you leave public support within a number of years, you get that entire amount for a down payment, because as you know, that is one of the major impediments for poor people being able to buy a home. They may be able to maintain it, but they would never be able to get it in the first place. And they've also learned how to think like a homeowner. And that really is what these self-sufficiency programs are about, getting them to the point where they're able to accumulate savings, where they're able to take advantage of educational opportunities, where they're able to get the training that they need, where we're able to provide daycare for a lot of the young women so that they can get their GED, their associate's degree, their bachelor's degree, learn to be self-sufficient, more importantly, teach that to their children so we can break these cycles of poverty that have plagued our country.
Thank you, sir. I'll just close and wrap it up, Mr. Chairman, with just a few thoughts. First, I really appreciate your panoramic view of the whole person and looking for ways to move folks towards self-sufficiency. I think as we continue to focus on the actual job of the HUD secretary, that we'll be surprised and pleased with the outcome. The distractions that we've seen in the news is not helpful whatsoever. I appreciate you taking responsibility, number one, as you just did. Number two, I appreciate the fact that you've set internal control so it won't be repeated. And number three, I hope that all that leads us back to what we should be focused on, is the incredible human potential that resides in so many places that only needs hope and opportunity and a pathway carved forward so that they can make the decision to move forward, because I know that they want to and they will if given the opportunity. The rest of the sideshow should be stopped and moved out of the way so that folks can see their best and brightest days ahead of them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That's very encouraging.
Senator Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I'd like to talk a little bit about, as I understand it, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, but the department's budget proposal is to eliminate funds for community development block grants. And much in my state, I think, has been impacted a lot by those block grants, particularly with regard to sewers. We have some serious issues in Alabama, particularly in the Black Belt, with sanitation and sewer systems that are outdated. Raw sewage is backing up into homes. I know that's not the case for everyone, but it is a serious problem in Alabama. So I haven't seen in the president's proposal certain infrastructure dollars available for sewer projects. So how would you address in the housing context an issue for sewer if you plan on doing away with the block grant, community development block grant proposal?
Thank you for that question, and congratulations on your election.
Thank you.
First of all, CDBG has had a very positive impact in many areas of the country. There also have been problems with directing the funds to the people who are supposed to be impacted, which are the low-income individuals. There are other mechanisms for taking care of, but I will tell you that there are billions of dollars in the CDBG pipeline already. It's going to take more than a year to disperse those funds, number one. Number two, through programs like the Opportunity Zones, which I hope you're becoming familiar with, it will be possible to address many of the same types of issues while at the same time encouraging tremendous input of private capital into those zones.
On that real quick, I mean, and I appreciate the fact that you got money in there. We need some, and I would invite you to come to Alabama to see some of this. But look, I'm all in favor of the Opportunity Zones. I think that's a great idea. But do you really expect a New York investor or somebody to invest money in one of the poorest counties in Alabama to help with their sewers? Do you really think that that's something that an investor is going to do?
When it's incorporated into a much larger project, when you incorporate the whole area, very frequently you have to deal with the infrastructure problems as well. You have to deal with the housing problems as well. So all of them are interconnected.
All right, I hope you're right. I really question whether or not we're going to get that kind of private investment in the areas that are impacted most in poor rural America. But be that as it may, I'm hoping that I think Congress will continue to fund those grants. The other thing I want to follow up with Senator Shelby's question about the dilapidated housing that is apparently a problem that you've recognized. Senator Shelby has seen it. I have seen it. But again, the administration proposed to eliminate the Housing Capital Fund that repairs this public housing. It is aging. In Alabama, we had $50 million that usually comes in, and those funds are also desperately needed. How are you going to make up that difference to address the very needs that you yourself talked about a few minutes ago in your answer to Senator Shelby?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is that we're not building a lot of public housing anymore. There's a good reason for that. It generally tends to fall into disrepair simply because there isn't the local interest in it. By converting these to public-private partnership opportunities through things like the RAD program, which has been extremely successful, 88,000 units have already been revamped that way. We have 30,000 more scheduled for this year. We have a waiting list of 86,000. Those things have been working very, very effectively. That, coupled with monies that will be brought in through the Opportunity Zones, I think will take care of a lot of issues. We're looking at unleashing probably in excess of $2 trillion. Those are major, major changes.
Well, I hope you're right. I question whether or not there's going to be that kind of investment in these housing projects. They don't make a lot of money. There's not that much of a return. I've represented people that have been in those projects. I've represented people who have owned a couple of those. But we'll see. We hope you're right, but I also hope that the Congress will once again come back and find a different route and continue to fund that program as well as the development block grants.
Thank
you. I appreciate your efforts. And the one thing I would say finally, and I know my time's up, but I do appreciate the fact that despite all the distractions, I do appreciate the fact that you are focusing on trying to lift people up. I think that's a good thing. I just don't want to ignore the fact that people, despite all the efforts to lift them up, they just can't quite make it. And there's a lot of people in my state that despite their efforts and their desire and their heart, and they're trying like hell, but they just can't quite make it. And we need to be there for those people continually.
I agree. We do need to be there for them, but that is part of the reason that we're embarking upon the Envision Center project, because we want to put the resources in place conveniently for them to be able to get them. The reason that you're successful, the reason I'm successful, is because there were things in our environment, there were people in our environment that helped us along the way. Nobody makes it on their own.
We can agree on that one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Secretary Carson, welcome to the committee.
Thank you.
When we met in my office before your confirmation, I talked a little bit about how I thought you could be a change agent in the department, and what was going to be critical is very quickly get in there and identify programs that are working and double down on them, and identify programs that are not, returning the value, and take the tough political position that we can put this money to a better and higher purpose. I, for one, think that the discussion about reducing your resources right now is premature. I think you probably need what you have and maybe some more. And what progress have you made in terms of really looking at the department and trying to really affect change so that we know that we're getting the best value and having the best impact on the people who need it?
Well, thank you for asking that question. We've made enormous amounts of progress. First of all, in terms of stabilizing the mutual mortgage insurance fund, in terms of stopping the hemorrhaging coming from reverse mortgage program, stopping the endorsement of PACE loans, which were putting the taxpayers at risk, stopping the churning that was going on with veterans, and strengthening the HUD-VASH program and other homelessness programs. This is one of the reasons that we've asked for more for homelessness than we ever did before. But looking at the actual numbers for the programs, there's over 7,000 programs. We're looking at the ones that actually work, evidence-based changes. And then looking internally, this is the first time that we've had a CFO in years. And what happens when you don't have a CFO in a large organization? You develop multiple little silos, every one of which thinks that they're doing things correct way. Well, we're bringing that all under one dome and assigning responsibilities. And I think that's making a very large difference. It's ruffling a few feathers in some places, but people don't like change. That's okay, because it's change for the good. It's going to work in the long run.
Mr. Secretary, I didn't plan to speak about it, but Senator Jones prompted a thought, and it has to do, I think it's very important for you to hold the line on identifying as many people that you can lift up and out of any reliance, mainly because that will provide you ultimately with more resources for those, as Senator Jones has correctly stated, may not. So I think that we always have to constantly make sure that we've got that balance right so that we can have that impact that actually changes the trajectory of somebody's life. And when you do that, then you can start really focusing on those who have unique circumstances that maybe with additional resources they too can be lifted out of. their circumstances. I think it's very important as somebody who was in those circumstances, and actually it relates to my next question about a month ago, I was in Nashville where I spent my junior high and high school years, and I rode always do a trip down memory lane, go to the places I lived. And I lived in a trailer park there. And I went to Sugarcane Lane, which was the trailer park I lived in, and took a picture of the trailer. And it made me think about manufactured housing, and it made me think about people who, when I ended up having to live there, I moved out of the trailer park, moved back, bought my own. I lived there with my family first. And I don't think that most people recognize that the regulatory burden that we place on the citizens of the United States hit the poorest among us the hardest. And if you're buying a mobile home and you're buying manufactured housing and you've got to go through the morass of regulations that we have today, there's no doubt that you're creating a higher price point.
Absolutely.
In my case, it could be the difference between a single wide and a single wide with a bump out. But what are you doing, and that's more of a blade level, so you may not be able to answer the question specifically, but it's one example of regulatory streamlining and regulatory relief that I think we need to focus on, and there are a number of others. Can you shed some light on that?
I'm glad you brought that up. Manufactured housing accounts for 10% of single-family dwellings, 22 million households. So it is substantial. And it is actually a potential solution for some of the housing issues, particularly in rural areas. If you look at the progress that has been made in manufactured housing recently, it's amazing. In fact, a lot of the housing you would not be able to distinguish from site-built housing, and yet the pricing is better. But the regulations are ridiculous. So, we've put a moratorium on that. We're inspecting from top to bottom all of those regulations right now and getting rid of a lot of them because I think this is an area where we can take advantage.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. I want to go back to the question asked by the ranking member at the beginning regarding the overall budget priorities, because as you agreed, the proposal that was put forward was a 14% cut from what had actually been provided the year before, and it does go to the question of priorities. Are you pleased with what you've seen of the current budget proposal working its way through the Congress on a bipartisan basis in terms of the numbers for HUD?
It could be improved. There's no question that it could be improved, but we will work with what we have. And we recognize that, the whole budgetary process is not a simple one.
Right.
We make proposals. It's actually Congress who actually establishes what the budget is. And whatever that budget is, we will work with it.
I understand that. But in terms of the overall levels for HUD, is that it's substantially more than you asked for. Are you pleased with what the increase that was provided by the Congress?
I am happy that we will be able to do even more.
Right. You'll be able to do more
effectively and more efficient.
So I was just reading a tweet from the President of the United States this morning where he was praising the funds for the Defense Department and military, which has bipartisan support here. He says he got the most ever for the military, and in fact, Congress has been really working on a bipartisan basis. Then he goes on to say, had to waste money on Democratic giveaways. You don't believe that the budget here for HUD is a giveaway, do you?
I wouldn't use those terms, but I would point out by the year 2048, everything we take in will be used to service the debt.
And Mr. Secretary, I've been talking about the dangers of the debt for a very long time, and I think the ranking member pointed out that the president just signed something that added over $1.5 trillion. So to the debt, CDBG, because you zero that out, right? You zeroed that out 2 years in a row in your proposal. The Congress has restored those fundings, and I know there's a number of projects that are still working their way through the pipeline, but that is a oversubscribed program. The demand for that, I can say, in the state of Maryland is much larger than the resources provided. And it's interesting that when we provided hurricane relief, a huge amount of that money went in the form of CDBG, did it not?
Well, remember, with hurricane relief, you're talking about CDBG-DR. Completely different program, by the way.
But one of the benefits of that program is that the money is flexible and can go to local jurisdictions for needs. But I want to ask you particular.
No, that's not true. DR, it is very targeted.
But I actually have, and I'm also looking now at the regulations that you had that went through, that accompanied the monies for hurricane relief. And there's actually something I thought was a good policy in there, which is that you say that we shouldn't be using these federal funds to rebuild in areas where you have floodplains, and it's important to take into account continued sea level rise. Can you explain to the committee why that's important to have there as part of the regulations?
Yeah, because it really doesn't make any sense to create the circumstances for the same thing to occur once again. And that includes also looking at things like building materials. And perhaps instead of just using drywall and creating the same problem if you have a flood, using some of the aquaphobic materials which repel water so that you don't have that problem again. We're looking at all of those things now.
No, I appreciate that. I just, Mr. Chairman, would like to put in the record a article, Washington Times, HUD tells states to consider sea level rise when rebuilding from storms.
Without objection.
And I think this was a good policy. I hope you'll talk to the president about it, because one of the first things the president did was reverse an executive order from the previous administration that applied that common sense principle government-wide, right? I mean, the same goes for federal funds through HUD or transportation. It doesn't make sense to invest taxpayer dollars in places where it won't go. So, Mr. Chairman, as we consider the flood reform legislation, I really hope we will focus on this, and I appreciate the Secretary's testimony. The last thing I will say, and Senator Menendez mentioned this, I hope you'll go back as you look at that HUD mission statement. The omission, at least in the current draft, of inclusive communities free of discrimination, I think the concern here is that some of the policy positions that you and the administration have taken, including your early opposition to the new rental, the provisions put forward by the previous administration to try and prevent the concentration of poverty and segregation and the use of vouchers, that sent a signal. And when you see the proposed change in mission statement on top of that, it's troubling. So I just wanted to flag, it's not just a question of words, it's the real concerns about actions out there suggesting a real
I appreciate that, sir, and that is in fact the reason that I wanted input from all 7,000 of our employees. Didn't necessarily want input from all the news media, but we got it anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Secretary Carson. And I'm going to harp on the same thing because it is a crisis in this country, particularly in Nevada, which is affordable housing crisis. Mm-hmm. Nearly every community in this nation has an affordable rental housing crisis, and it's worse in Nevada. Families earning $30,000 a year are unable to find an affordable home. For every 100 extremely low-income families, there are only 15 affordable apartments. High rents are driving thousands into homelessness. Our waiting lists for public housing in Section 8 are in tens of thousands, with families waiting years for help. Yet, this is the second year in a row that this administration planned to eviscerate the already inadequate funding that we provide for affordable housing. Thank goodness Congress is the one that provides the funding and saw the need to ensure that we are shoring up those resources for affordable housing. But what I'd like to know, now that you have those resources, what is your plan to help us address the affordable housing crisis in this country?
You know, one of the things that has really impressed me as I've traveled around the country are places like Liberty Square. You may be familiar with that in Miami. One of the notoriously horrible public housing sites that through the public-private partnerships is going from 700 units to 1,600 and developing a complete holistic community. Those are the kinds of things that I like. You look at Eastlake in Atlanta, one of the most crime-ridden places with schools that were failing, and now one of the 2 top charter schools and a neighborhood that is flourishing, and trying to, keep people from the outside from coming in and taking over.
Thank you. And Secretary Carson, I don't mean to interrupt. I only have so much time. I'm talking about affordable housing, not just Section 8. I'm talking about housing for individuals that want to rent a home because they can't afford to purchase it and they can't even afford the rent.
Sure.
So what
Those are
you
affordable
doing?
housings
What
that I
is-
just talked to you
Right,
about.
and there's workforce housing that we need in this country that is not affordable as well. So talk to me about what HUD is specifically doing. What programs, what are you doing to address this need in our communities and working with our state and local communities?
Well, one of the things that I think has been quite effective is our push to enhance Section 3 and make it more than just a suggestion.
What do you mean by a push to enhance?
Well, Section 3 has been on the books for 50 years, has been seldom used because it's easy for people to find excuses not to use it. So we are tightening that up to use it. And for example, I was in Chicago recently. An entire building was being redeveloped by Section 3 workers. They were incredibly proud of the work they were doing, but more importantly, they were gaining skills which allowed them to then move out, which made room for others.
So besides Section 3 housing and a push to enhance it, what else are you doing?
Well, we're trying to increase the number of units that are dealt with through the RAD program. This has proved to be incredibly effective. Other types of public-private partnerships, especially going to be enhanced through the Opportunity Zone with enormous amount of infusion of private capital into these distressed areas.
Okay. So can I get a commitment from you that you will work with us on addressing affordable housing and specifically identify the programs within HUD and within your agencies that are geared towards addressing this issue?
I would be more than happy to do that. That's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. When you appeared before this committee prior to your confirmation, you promised me that you would make sure that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people were not faced with discrimination. At your confirmation hearing on January 12th, in response to a question from Ranking Member Brown about some of the concerning comments you've made about LGBTQ people, you assured this committee saying, quote, "I would enforce all the laws of the land, and I believe that all Americans, regardless of the new things that you mentioned, should be protected by the law." But instead, you've continued to undercut provisions HUD's efforts to end discrimination. On July 6, 2017, I, along with 28 other senators, sent a letter to the department requesting that you reinstate resources that were on your agency's website that protect LGBTQ people from housing discrimination, and I still have not received a response. What's been the delay? Is it normal for your agency to take nearly 9 months to respond to 28 U.S. senators?
Well, first of all, we've finally got a general counsel in December. I don't know that you can have it both ways.
What does that mean?
That means you can't tell us to deal with this complex legal issue and not give us the people that we need to do it.
A complex legal issue that was already determined by legal counsel and the administration prior to you? You felt to make changes and then think that you need to have a second look at it?
A complex legal issue that must take into account the rights of all the constituents who are involved, and not just from one point of view.
I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about, but I would appreciate a rapid, quick response. Now that, are you saying you still need legal counsel before you can make a determination that you want to prohibit discrimination?
We have spent a lot of time talking about this issue since the general counsel has been there, and I think there's going to be something going back up very soon. We've already got something going up about the homeless children who are being affected. It's an issue that we're truly concerned about, but it has to be done the right way.
Secretary Carson, I know my time is up. I appreciate the ranking member and the chair's indulgence. Thank you.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 50 years ago, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, but housing discrimination is still a huge problem in this country. According to a recent study, minority borrowers were more likely to be denied a mortgage than similar white borrowers in 61 cities across this country. Now, HUD is responsible for combating housing discrimination, and during your confirmation process, I asked you about your commitment to enforcing laws against housing discrimination, despite whatever personal feelings you had about those laws, and you said at that hearing, quote, "I will follow the law." And I remember hoping that that was true. So, Secretary Carson, it's been a year now. Can you name a few of the things you've done to reduce housing discrimination in your time at HUD?
First of all, we are constantly involved in lawsuits that we have brought against people for housing discrimination.
So are you saying you've initiated many lawsuits over the past year? Is that on discrimination issues? Is that what you're saying?
That is an ongoing process.
So you have
even to this day.
initiated how many lawsuits over the last year?
I can't tell you how many. We can certainly get someone to follow up with you on that.
Okay, anything more?
I think that's obviously very important. The way I kind of look at it is when I talk about fair.
I'm sorry, I'm not asking you to get into your description of it. I just want to know what you've done to reduce, the specific things you've done to help reduce housing discrimination. And you've said you've initiated many lawsuits, and you'll get back to me on the exact number. And I just want to know other specific things you have done. Anything more?
Well, I would simply say that what we do is to try to create a fair environment for all people and all of our policies. So when we create a fair
Carson,
environment for everybody, that means minorities as well.
That's the question I'm asking, though, is dealing specifically with discrimination, which is the problem. Mr. Secretary, I wanted to give you a chance to make your case, because when I look at your track record at HUD, I just see you headed in the wrong direction, that is going backwards. And I want to give you one example. The Fair Housing Act directed HUD to, quote, affirmatively further fair housing. That is the law. And in 2015, HUD implemented that mandate by issuing a rule that required communities that ask for block grants from HUD to analyze obstacles that minority residents face and to propose plans to address them. Civil rights groups and housing advocates at the time said the rule would be an important tool for reducing segregation and discrimination. Then you took over and you delayed the effective date of that rule until at least 2020. You even said that HUD wouldn't even review whatever information cities had about discrimination that they had already submitted to HUD. So, Secretary Carson, do you think that delaying the 2015 HUD rule for several more years has helped reduce housing discrimination?
I hope you'll give me an opportunity to answer that question.
Well, I hope you will answer it.
Okay. First of all, we were petitioned by dozens and dozens of cities and municipalities to, in fact, delay it because it costs between $100,000 and $800,000 to follow the regulations that were put in place, and they had to hire 2 or 3 people. This is great if you have a lot of money. It's not.
Excuse me, Secretary Carson, let me just remind you, this is a question about following the law. The law clearly says affirmatively further fair housing. It doesn't say cut back on that because you're concerned about compliance costs. And I have to say, I am very concerned that you pick compliance costs as your answer when how you previously described your real concern as, quote, that this was a failed socialist experiment to try to reduce discrimination. Let me ask you about another example. The Obama administration had issued a rule on housing vouchers that made a critical change in how the value of a housing voucher was calculated. It was called the Small Area Fair Rent Rule. The Obama administration had collected mountains of data showing that changing the calculation would reduce segregation in metro areas. But when you took over, you tried to delay the effective date of the rule for another 2 years. So did you think that delaying the effective date of this rule would reduce housing discrimination?
Well, first of all, we didn't delay it.
You tried.
Let me tell you what we did. We said those municipalities that are not ready to implement it, because we had multiple people call us, said we can't do this, we said you have another year to get ready. For the ones who were ready to do it, we said you can do it right now or any time up until that year. So we did not delay it. That was a mischaracterization.
You know, I'm sorry, the reports were that you tried to delay it and got into some trouble.
Those were the reports.
You know,
that's not the facts.
Mr. Secretary, a lot of people are criticizing you for spending tens of thousands of dollars in taxpayer money on fancy furniture. And don't get me wrong, I think scamming the taxpayers is a scandal. But the biggest scandal of your tenure is your unwillingness to do your job and enforce the laws that reduce housing discrimination and segregation across this country. Decades of housing discrimination have helped create an enormous wealth gap between white and black families, and the gap between white homeownership rates and black homeownership rates is 30 percentage points larger than it was back in 1968. In 1968, the typical black family had 1/6 as much wealth as the typical white family. Now it is 1/10. We have gone backwards since the civil rights era. It is HUD's job to help end housing discrimination. That's what the law said. You said you would enforce these laws. You haven't, and I think that's the scandal that should get you fired.
Well, I don't think that you have characterized things in any way close to what is accurate, but you're welcome to say whatever you want.
No, I really resent that remark. I have asked the question about how it is that delaying enforcement of rules that were already in place to help end housing discrimination would help. I ask you to make your case, and all you can say is compliance costs were high. No. That does not explain how it is that you were going to delay enforcement of those rules, and that was going to help end housing discrimination.
I think I explained it to you quite well, that with the small area fair markets, that we did not tell people that they couldn't do it.
I would not describe
we tell them that they could do it, go ahead with that immediately. There's no delay if you're ready to do it.
You won't even look at the data that's come into HUD. That's not a commitment to ending housing discrimination.
Senator Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in our several conversations.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick reminder, Mox News survives solely on your tips and contributions. It's easy to make a contribution or a tip or leave a tip at moxnews.com, or there are clickable links in the text body of this video. It should take the average person, most people, probably less than 2 minutes. Thanks very much for your time and your continued support. Stay cool. One of these days, this war is going to end. Till that day.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in our several conversations before your nomination and otherwise, made the point about veterans' homelessness. Yes. We owe a great deal to our veterans, and it is, I think, discouraging to all of us when we see them without adequate housing, and too many of them are in that situation. The Interagency Council on Homelessness will be completing a report soon, which we've requested, and could you update the committee on your efforts that you've taken directly to address this issue of veterans' homelessness?
Well, you know, 1% of our population protects the other 99% of us, and I think we owe a great deal to our veterans. And the HUD-VASH program has been responsible for 47% reduction in homelessness for veterans. We will continue to support that program and enhance it. Also, many of our other homeless programs affect veterans. We've asked for a record amount of money for homeless programs this year, including the Continuum of Care program, which supports more than 7,000 different homeless programs, many of which are affecting our veterans. But the place where the biggest problems with veterans homelessness are on the West Coast and in New York City. And it's principally because the incomes are not rising as fast as the property values. And because of some of the restrictive regulations and zoning characteristics, that is a big problem for which we're going to need a lot of help, because we don't have jurisdiction over the zoning. Something needs to be done about that, because a lot of people have this ideal that if you're bringing multifamily housing in, that you're going to be bringing in some kind of dilapidated project. That is no longer the case, particularly when it's done through public-private partnerships. These are beautiful places, and we're going to need help, obviously from Congress and from local and state governments to be able to help rectify that situation. But across the rest of the country, not including the West Coast and New York City, homelessness is actually going down, and you've probably read many of the reports that a number of municipalities have declared victory when it comes to homelessness for veterans.
In fact, Mr. Secretary, I think Rhode Island a few years ago thought we were at that moment. And in fact, ironically and unfortunately, our homelessness population of veterans is going up, and we're not alone. Because of our small size, we're looking at estimates about 89 homeless veterans in 2016, but that's 95 now. That's just 6 or 7 men and women, but that's important to me. The other issue is I'm glad you put the emphasis on the HUD-VASH program, because unfortunately the President requested in FY18 just $7 million of a $40 million program and nothing for FY19.
Yes, the reason for that is because we have adequate vouchers. They can be reissued. We do need some authority from Congress to shift the vouchers around, but we have adequate numbers. When we get to a point where it's getting close, we will ask for more money.
Well, again, my concern is that it's more than close, and particularly you point out some of the higher price areas of the country where we could consider even increasing the voucher if that would make a difference. But we have just too many veterans that are not housed to be sitting back and saying we don't need any additional resources. I hope our omnibus, with Senator Collins' efforts and my efforts, but her efforts particularly, we will provide $40 million for 5,100 new housing vouchers for veterans. With the President's proposal, there'd be zero, and you'd have some real problems. The other issue is not so much just the veterans population, it's the chronically homeless, those people who consistently are unable to be housed, despite efforts. Sometimes they qualify for benefits, sometimes they receive benefits, but they just cannot find themselves into a permanent, stable living arrangement. Any comments or thoughts to identify and address these needs?
Well, first of all, we need to recognize that it actually costs more to keep a person on the street than it does to house a person. And that's the whole concept between housing first, which we appreciate and embrace. But I add to it housing second and housing third, which means housing second, you diagnose the reason that they're there, and housing third, you do everything you can to fix it. That, along with examining each of the homelessness programs in terms of their effectiveness, is what is making the difference as we continue to drive it down. Someone did make a comment that homelessness had gone up on the watch of this administration. That 0.7% increase was from the homelessness count in January of 2017, which was for the year 2016, just to set the record straight.
Well, again, we have to do all we can to keep that record of decline, which I think it has been over the years preceding 2017, accelerating, not decelerating, and that's one of the reasons we funded the VASH housing HUD vouchers.
And I appreciate your attention to that.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's good to see you again. I want to speak about property assessed clean energy loans. We discussed this last year. In June 2016, the Department of Housing and Urban Development decided the Federal Housing Administration would change its mortgage policy to start insuring mortgages that had a PACE lien. For those not familiar with it, PACE loans or PACE liens are collected through local taxing authorities. They didn't go through any kind of underwriting. and they had super priority over mortgages. So that meant, in default, the lender who had installed, say, solar panels or new windows or something would get paid back before the mortgagor or before the taxpayer if that mortgage is insured by FHA. There were horrible cases, instances of elderly widows being scammed down to $50,000 on loan shark level interest rates. And we first discussed that back in April of 2017. I want to show you a flyer that we recently came to see. I think it goes to show that these loans are placed in priority, no money down, and clearly demonstrates, if you just look at some of the language on this flyer, that they're being marketed towards people who have bad credit or who have no credit, and designed to scam out homeowners and ultimately the people from whom they borrow money, or in your case, the taxpayer who insures their mortgages. I mean, look at this. Have bad credit? No problem. What qualifies is your property. These loans average $25,000, which means the taxpayer could be on hook under the 2016 policy for up to $25,000. And I'd asked you to look at it and put out some new guidance, and I want to thank you for your decision in December. On December 5th, you announced that the FHA would no longer issue new mortgages on properties that included these kind of PACE loans. I just want to read briefly from the statement you issued at the time because I found it very compelling. FHA can no longer tolerate putting taxpayers at risk by allowing obligations like these to be placed ahead of the mortgage itself in the event of default. Assessments such as these are potentially dangerous for our mutual mortgage insurance fund and may have serious consequences on a consumer's ability to repay or when they attempt to refinance their mortgage and sell their home. Thank you again for that decision. Mr. Secretary, I want to point out to you, though, that the Senate recently passed the Economic Growth, Regulatory Reform, and Consumer Protection Act, which included language from my bill that would subject these scam loans to the Truth in Lending Act. In your opinion, does that represent a positive step forward for these consumers and the taxpayer?
That is a huge step forward, and I just want to thank you for taking the lead on this, because it was really you who brought this to my attention in the first place, and we did act upon it. And I do appreciate the fact that there is recognition that we actually do some good things.
Thank you. And I hope the House passes it and the President can sign it into law in short order, so when vulnerable consumers are targeted by these scam loans, they will at least know the true terms that they're facing for the loans. However, even if that does pass into law and the Truth in Lending Act applies to these PACE loans, they would still have priority over mortgages. So I assume that even if that provision passes into law, you will continue with your December 2017 decision that the FHA will not insure loans that have a PACE lien on them.
Without question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Secretary Carson. When you were nominated for this position, you committed, both in my office and before this committee, to personally visit and provide full HUD resources to assist East Chicago, Indiana, where the lives of more than 300 families, including many children, were at risk due to significant lead and arsenic exposure. You did as you said. You supported HUD's continued relocation efforts for those 300 families. You joined me in August of last year to visit East Chicago, and in September awarded $4 million to the East Chicago Housing Authority for the safety, security, and demolition of the contaminated complex. We are grateful for your attention, and we are grateful for the commitments to the residents of East Chicago.
Thank you.
Can I have your commitment that HUD will continue to partner with East Chicago as demolition of the housing complex is actually set to begin this month, followed by a lengthy environmental cleanup and redevelopment effort, that you'll continue to be our partner in this effort?
We will not only continue to be a partner with that, but this is an area, particularly the Superfunds and the lead, that we're concerned about across the nation and putting a great deal of emphasis on, because it has huge implications down the road in terms of the health of those, particularly children who are affected, and also the cost of dealing with the problems that they develop.
Last week, the Senate passed S-2155, a package crafted by members of this committee, including myself. Section 312 requires HUD to report to Congress on its policies and enforcement related to lead-based paint hazard prevention and abatement. The report also requires HUD to offer recommendations and best practices for itself, for public housing agencies, and landlords to ensure our housing policies fully protect the health and safety of children. This legislation is at the House now, but are you willing to direct HUD staff to begin this review immediately and instruct them to complete the report as soon as possible?
Yes, absolutely, and I appreciate your leadership in this area.
It is imperative that HUD updates its lead-based paint policies, particularly in housing with young children. We can never allow there to be another East Chicago situation. The report we discussed a minute ago is intended to require HUD to take a holistic look at your policies. It's not intended to delay ongoing efforts in Congress to enact the Lead Safe Housing for Kids Act to require additional lead-based paint testing and risk assessments in federally subsidized households with young children. Senators Scott and Menendez on this committee are also co-sponsors of this bipartisan bill. As a medical doctor, do you believe visual assessments alone are sufficient to identify the presence of lead-based paint hazards to ensure the environmental safety and health of our children?
I think there's a lot to be said for visual inspections, but no, I don't think that is adequate. And we are continuing to look at other things. There is a multi-agency task force to look at environmental problems such as lead, and we have talked about that. I actually would love to see universal screening for this. Just make it part of the panel that we look at, because sometimes we think that this only affects people in a certain area, but it affects people everywhere. Everywhere there's older housing, even in some of the most luxurious places in our country. And the impact on those brains is going to be significant. So I, again, want to thank you for leading out in this.
Thank you. One more question. As you know, 80% of global RV manufacturing occurs in my state, especially in the area of Elkhart County, just down the road from where I happen to live. As we've discussed many times, RVs are specifically exempted from HUD's manufactured housing regulations. However, due to technological industry advancements, the RV exemption that was written by HUD in the 1980s is outdated and in desperate need of update. Later today, Secretary, you will receive a letter from me and several other senators urging HUD to finalize its proposed rule from 2016 to properly exempt RVs from manufactured housing regulations. When can we expect HUD to finally complete this rulemaking?
As I mentioned earlier, probably before you came in, we are conducting a top-to-bottom review of all the regulations associated with manufactured housing that will include the regulations putting RVs under the HUD's jurisdiction.
Thank you, Mrs. Secretary, and thanks for your work.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, how are you?
Doing well. Good to see you.
Please give my best to your better half.
Well.
I want to talk about two subjects. First, the flooding in Louisiana. You were very generous with your time. You and Mrs. Carson, you came down and toured Louisiana. Our flooding took place in the spring of 2016 in North Louisiana, some in South Louisiana, and in South Louisiana in August of 2016. So let's call it 2 years ago. The American taxpayer has generally given Louisiana $1.3 billion to help us recover. That's the good news. The governor in my state appointed a committee to disperse the money. We've had the money a long time. Yeah. Thank you very much. The governor's committee has dispersed a grand total of $61 million out of $1.3 billion to taxpayers. Now, everybody else has got paid, including but not limited to the contractors. But our taxpayers aren't getting very much. And I wish I could tell you it's going to get better. They've set up a bureaucracy down there to rival anything we've got in Washington, D.C. Here's my question. We're probably going to be getting more money. Thank you once again, American taxpayer. in CDBG funds, about $800 million. You're in charge of that.
Right.
I know you respect taxpayer money, unlike some. Would you ask your folks, please, to try to help us ensure that that money is going to be spent on people,
Right.
and not on consultants, not on contractors, not on people's friends, but to the people who flooded. Just a thought.
Absolutely.
And please insist on that with this $800 million. Because the governor keeps asking me and Senator Cassidy, get us more money, get us more money. And my response has always been, John Bell, you know, the first question I always get is, well, how much of it have you spent that we already gave you?
Right.
And I kept to tell the truth.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that with the advent of our CFO, one of the very first things that we have begun to look at is the grant process, how the grants are given, what the metrics and requirements are, particularly in terms of dissemination spending of the money. So, and it's particularly for the reason that you just mentioned. So that is something that you will be seeing the results of quite quickly. Also, you know, with the disaster funding in general, we have cut a large number of the regulations in order to get money into people's hands much faster, working with FEMA, working with SBA, working with local, state governments and officials. That is one of our prime goals. And I think with the disasters that occurred last year, we've already seen a vast improvement, and we're going to continue to work on that to improve that.
Well, I've asked Governor Edwards to get rid of his committee and just take control of this thing himself and put a select group of people in charge and call them in and say, start distributing this money to the real people who were hurt.
Right.
And I've been in government long enough to know that if he brings in 4 or 5 of them, at least one of them is going to say, oh, Governor, it's really complicated and I need more money for administration. That's the one you fire.
Right.
And then the other 4 kind of realize you're serious. And if you could help us on this CDBG money to make sure that they have a plan to spend it, that's going to, the money's going to actually be spent on people and not the consultants, so we can try to help these poor folks.
Yeah. You and I are completely aligned on that. We will be working very hard with you on that.
Well, and thank you for your leadership. Don't let them get you down.
They'll try, but they won't. They just encourage me.
I understand. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. And Senator Brown has asked for another round for some more personal, another round for him to ask some more questions.
I'm not sure who this they is that are trying to keep it down, but Mr. Secretary, I thank you again for being here. And I yesterday was with Secretary Shulkin in the Veterans Committee, and I appreciate the efforts on HUD-VASH. I appreciate the efforts on eliminating veterans homelessness that began several years ago that, as you said, has made progress. I don't understand, though, when we know HUD-VASH works and we know we put more money in HUD-VASH, that Secretary Shulkin had, I couldn't tell for sure, either not had conversations with you or not been encouraged by you to increase the budget, nor you to him.
We had multiple conversations.
Yeah, well, good. But why then is the HUD-VASH vouchers not increasing when we know they work?
Again, it's because, you know, we base our requests on what the requests are, what people need. And we have adequate number of vouchers and an adequate number of vouchers that can be reissued. The biggest problem is that we don't have the authority to move the vouchers from a place where there's excess to a place where they're needed. This is what we really need. We don't need to just throw more money.
If that's the case, we will work with you. I've never heard that, but if that's the case, we will work with you.
That is the case.
Making that happen. A couple of questions. You say you want to promote self-sufficiency by increasing the number of people who leave the program with positive outcomes. An admirable approach. What do you consider a positive outcome?
I consider a positive outcome not requiring government assistance.
And that's how you measure the outcome for families?
I would consider that a positive outcome.
Do you measure negative outcomes too?
What do you mean by that?
Well, do you measure an outcome that's not positive? If you don't consider it positive,
Well,
do you
in
provide measures
Yeah,
for when they're
in
not?
measuring the positive outcomes, you automatically measure the negative outcomes.
Well, do you break that down on how many people will lose housing under your proposal for rent reforms?
Under our proposals, we don't anticipate anybody losing housing.
So you increase $1,800 a year requirement for housing. You don't think you'll lose people who are making $3,000 or $4,000 a year?
We don't,
Where's that money coming?
because one of the other things we're doing is instead of requiring an annual assessment of their income, it's going to be moved to every 3 years. Because in the past, people hit that ceiling. They say, I don't want to make any more money because it's going to cause my rent to go up. That doesn't happen now. And that means that they're more likely to get into a position where they are making more money and where they're more likely to be able to get out of the housing.
That is magical presidential candidate thinking. I just don't, somebody's making $3,000 or $4,000 a year, they don't want to make more because their housing would cost more. And
well, $3,000 or $4,000, that's not the right number by the way.
well, you said 9,000. The number that was leaked seemed closer to 3, but I'll give you the 9. I just can't imagine in these calculations when people pay half their rent, half their income in housing, that they are making that calculation that way, and you base.
Well, you probably
your
also
numbers
know
on
that that's
way.
not the complete number. You probably know that.
Well, it's a big part of the number. Let me shift to something else. You indicated to Senator Jones the reason for the poor repair of public housing is a lack of local interest. So should local government maintain these federal assets? Is that what you're saying?
When I talk about local interests, I'm talking about private sector. Of course, the local government should be involved as well, but the private sector.
But these people that are living there just aren't keeping up their homes well enough. Do these very, very low-income people who have money, often not enough money to paint, not enough money to fix much of anything, it's kind of blaming them, right?
No, not at all.
So what is it? If they're not, who's not keeping it up then?
Traditionally, if you know much about real estate, you know that whether it is a government property or not, when people are there who are renters and don't have any particular dog in the fight, that places tend to deteriorate. You know that, don't you?
They don't have a dog in the fight. They also don't have money much to keep it up. I understand the law of the commons and all that, but shouldn't the federal government be more of a partner? I mean, you're cutting the budget to renovate, to keep up, to repair these homes, when isn't the real problem a lack of federal support for these homes?
Well, in terms of capital funds, for decades now, we've been putting billions of dollars into the capital funds, and what has happened?
So let's just pull out money. You've acknowledged that HUD-VASH works better because we actually fund it. You've acknowledged that more money means when, in the response to the budget, I believe from Senator Van Hollen, there's more money in the budget. Well, you said I'll be able to do more good things with that money, but you're advocating a smaller budget.
I think you're a good man, and I think you're going to understand what I'm about to say. Okay. We've been putting a lot of money into these capital funds to maintain these buildings, and the number that we need to maintain it keeps going up. Therefore, what we need to do is look for a different way. We need to look for a better way to maintain and to redevelop these things.
Well, perhaps, Mr. Secretary, but when a better way is when 1 in 4 people renting in this country spend at least half their income on housing, when 1 in 4 residents own homeowners and renters in Cleveland, Ohio, not Cleveland, the county of Cuyahoga, which has a lot of wealth too, a lot of middle-class people, a lot of working families, a lot of everything. 1 out of 4 of those people, of those residents, I'm one of them, 1 out of 4 of them spend more than at least half their income. How can you say that cutting the budget 14% is going to make this a better situation? When the government when vouchers and housing assistance is only about 1/4 of those families.
Well, probably would have been even more than 14% if I hadn't made multiple trips to talk to people. You know, we have to recognize that we're in a difficult situation. I would love to work with you. I've already been working with some of the housing advocates. We're trying to find solutions. I don't think
the difficult situation meaning the budget deficit. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
And did you speak up about this last year when we blew a hole?
I constantly speak up about it.
You spoke up about the budget deficit.
Yes, I did.
Did you ask any members of the House or Senate to vote no on the blow a hole in the budget tax bill?
Not on this tax bill. I haven't talked to them, but you know, it is.
That's the most recent one that blew a huge hole in the federal budget. And then now we're coming and we've got to make up for it.
Well, I hope you will join me in talking to everybody you can about it, because we're talking about the future of our country. We're talking about our children and our grandchildren.
As we were last fall when we gave huge tax cuts to people like you and the cabinet members.
I didn't get a tax cut.
Well, you will.
No.
Under this.
I didn't. I won't.
Well, maybe
my taxes are going up.
We'll see.
There's no question about it. Big time.
Now, I'll say it more precisely. Many in the president's cabinet, because the 1%, and lots of them are well represented in the cabinet, 1% did really, really well under this tax bill. You know that. That's fact. And we have a hole in the budget, and Speaker Ryan says we got to go after Medicare. We got to go after Medicaid. We got to. Why is it the wealthy do better and better, but those who are struggling, we take it out on them? We put the burdens on their backs, and you're part of that, Mr. Secretary.
Is it a problem that more companies are returning to our shores from overseas?
We'll see how many do that.
Is it a problem that people are getting bonuses that are helping them?
I can answer your answer.
Is it a problem that
Mr. Secretary, I will take the microphone. I can anecdote you with I can anecdote back to you.
Those aren't anecdotes.
Well,
those are facts.
Well, so is an engineer that came up to me that said his company, because of the tax bill, is going to move engineers, going to move dozens of engineers from Ohio to.
But the point is, we don't need to fight about this
because of the tax bill. So
we don't need to fight about it.
We don't need to fight about it. But if you're going to talk about the budget deficit and build your budget on that and your reason for cutting spending on a whole lot of low-income people, don't blame it on the federal budget when the federal budget got worse because of what your president, our president, and your cabinet was advocating in this Congress.
We're going to leave the debate over the tax bill at that.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Kennedy has asked for the last word. I ask him to please keep it brief.
Sharon's lead there. Look, Senator Brown, as usual, makes some very salient points. But I want to thank you for trying to help Americans know the dignity of being self-sufficient. I don't think the American people get enough credit, Mr. Secretary. You know, we spend about $1 trillion a year, state and local social programs. In our country, if you're hungry, we feed you. If you're homeless, we house you. If you're too poor to be sick, we pay for your doctor. A lot of other countries just let you die.
Right.
But the problem is that so many of our programs to help people have become parking lots when they're supposed to be bridges.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that we've become a government that automatically sees folks as victims, which can breed dependency as opposed to potential workers.
Right.
And I would I thank you for, and I strongly encourage you to continue the effort. So if somebody needs a place to live, we ought to provide it. But if they're between the ages of 18 and 65, and they're not disabled, then we need to ask them to work 20 hours a week, or go back to school 20 hours a week, or do community service 20 hours a week. And I'm not talking about a mother with a sick baby in her arms. I'm not talking about asking grandpa to leave the nursing home. And you've done a lot toward that. And I know a lot of people say, you know, it makes you cold and heartless. And they say that by implication about the American people. We're spending $1 trillion. And I don't know. I try to be a good Methodist. I believe in free will. And I don't think these are people who need a hand up or want to stay there.
Right.
And you've worked at that. And I know some people have bashed you. And I just wanted to thank you for it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And, you know, on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, you know, don't worry about it when people say all kind of horrible things about you.
Yeah.
Just do the right thing. And, you know, that's what's driving us right now. I've been blessed with a tremendous team, just wonderful people. And we're going to get people out of poverty. And it's going to change the paradigm in this country.
I mean, to sum it up, you know, I don't want to take food stamps or affordable housing away from people in need.
Sure.
But I do want fewer people to need food stamps and affordable housing. And I don't know a single person, maybe there are some, but I don't know a single, and I know a number. I don't know a single person who is dependent on government who really wants to be.
Right.
And I'm not talking about just, okay, go get a job. There are programs that have been set up. Kentucky has a great one where we'll help you get a job. This economy, thanks to those tax cuts, is doing great. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I'm still doing 5 minutes better than Senator Brown. I'm going to wrap it up here.
Well, thank you, Senator. And I just want to say that, you know, we, the government, maybe not the current government, but collectively, we're the ones who created the situation of dependency. And I think we have a responsibility to fix it.
Thank you, sir.
All right, with that, the hearing will conclude. That concludes the questioning, and I want to once again thank you, Secretary Carson, for coming and reporting to us and being here with us this morning.
Thank you.
For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those questions are due next Thursday, March 29th. And Mr. Secretary, I'd ask that you respond to any questions as soon as you possibly can.
Thank you.
With that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Doc. Yeah, and you know you then you know you're in trouble. Good job.